Since arriving on the scene in 1966, Neil Young has demonstrated his love of music within his own wide-reaching and eclectic back catalogue. The many different musical paths infused into his work include both contemporary influences as well as his earliest musical interests. Neil Young was born in 1945 in Toronto, Canada, a city not noted for its musical invention. Like everyone else at the time, Young was coming into contact with popular genres such as rhythm and blues and jazz that had crossed the border from the United States. However, it was the seismic shift in music that occurred during the mid-1950s that bewitched the world and truly awoke his musical passion.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on, join me home. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1.
Although Neil Young grew up in Canada, and you don't think of that as being a place where early rock and roll had as much impact as the United States and even some parts of Great Britain, I think that, like all people who were just about to enter their teens when the first wave of rock and roll hit, it really impacted Neil Young heavily, not just musically, but the lifestyle that rock and roll was associated with changed the way that he and almost an entire generation.
Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis. Artists who all made a collective impact on a musically impressionable Neil Young.
You know, those early days of rock and roll, I think, for young people who were interested in music, was a revelation. I mean, Robbie Robertson once said it was as if this curtain opened and there were all these amazing characters on the stage. A lot of the pop music at that time wasn't terribly inspiring, you know. How much was that doggy in the window, you know, this kind of stuff. The idea, you know, embodied in characters like, you know, Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, the idea that this music could be that explosive and even that scary. You know, Elvis Presley, as benign a figure as he often seems now, was a genuinely frightening figure. And for someone like Neil Young, who is going to go on such a kind of complicated musical journey, seeing all these different styles and seeing all the wildness and all the beauty and all the kind of lyricism and all of the roar of what that music was a tremendous influence. It had a, you know, just a huge impact.
To know just what to do. From an early age, Neil Young was mesmerized by the rock and roll movement and had a particular fascination with Elvis Presley, who had taken the world by storm with his hypnotic persona and sound.
These were iconic figures that, you know, when you saw them on TV, it was an absolute event. And there was a wild, unrestrained quality about the great early rock and rollers, about Jerry Lee, about Elvis.
I would say they all had charisma. Certainly Presley had charisma. It wouldn't seem radical now, but back in those days, I remember when Elvis Presley came out in the scene, the next day at school, it was just a buzz at school. Everybody's saying, "Did you see that guy on TV last night?" I think it was on Tommy Dorsey's show, and everybody was just talking about it.
He was a mix of the Southern blues with a beat, with a country influence. He was another new direction, and of course he was such a charismatic person and such a great entertainer.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time.
I think Neil Young fairly early saw how Elvis Presley lost his raw energy that he'd had in the Sun studio. You know, he quickly identified Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis as somewhat more authentic than certainly what Elvis had become.
It was menacing as well within the context of the 50s. These were figures that stayed with all of the characters in the Neil Young story, all his contemporaries. They will all name these great rock icons because they were the ones that showed them the possibility of not just succeeding in the music world, but actually that pop music could have genuine potency. When Little Richard appeared even on TV, it was like somebody from outer space. He used to say that about Elvis. I mean, when Jerry Lee came along, he was even wilder than Elvis. And when Little Richard came along, he was black and wore makeup. I mean, it was just surreal. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like this.
Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard and Elvis Presley breathed new life into 1950s music and broadened the sonic palette for Neil Young and his generation.
I want to love you like a lover should.
What the great 50s artists have done for Neil Young is they liberated him as a child and as a teenager from a rather straight-laced world as they did with everybody else.
One of the interesting things about Neil Young is that he's actually 4 or 5 years younger than the first generation of 60s rockers, the Beatles, the Stones, the Bob Dylans of this world, who were, of course, all hugely influenced by Elvis Presley and the emergence of rock and roll in the mid-50s. I think Neil Young was hugely influenced by it, but he is only about 9 or 10 years old when Elvis Presley comes along, whereas the people we've just been talking about were teenagers. So he experiences it in a slightly different way, I think. Whereas the Beatles and the Stones growing up in England and Bob Dylan in Minnesota buy into Elvis Presley and rock and roll as this sort of teenage rebellion thing, I think Neil Young is actually watching Elvis Presley on television with his mum. So it's a slightly different experience. But this is the thing that gets him into music, as indeed it did all of these people who were a few years older than him.
And rock and roll would be the catalyst for Young's career, with the sounds of the early pioneers traceable throughout the work that would define him in the late 60s and early 70s. Although Young's eventual sound would lie predominantly with more modern rock and folk styles, during his experimental phase in the 1980s, he would produce an album in the classic rock and roll style entitled Everybody's Rocking. Perceived as a lesser work in his canon, and also even as an act of antagonism against his record company, it nevertheless gave Young the opportunity to doff his cap to the artists who had first awakened him to music.
I think because he was such a young boy when rock and roll started, and he was absorbing other influences as well from all over the place, he didn't have this same bedrock in rock and roll, but he came to regard it almost just as a genre within this broader scope of music. So when we get to the 1980s, and he embarks on what really is a series of genre albums, whether it's country music on Old Ways or electronic music on Trans. He makes Everybody's Rocking. He thinks, right, I've done the electronic album, I've done the country album, now I'm going to do a rock and roll album.
On a record like Everybody's Rocking, I mean, I think Neil Young was attempting to really channel that incredible energy of early rock and roll, the kind of simplicity that was there. A sense that things had gotten too complex, kind of too overblown, too many expectations, and it was just, hey, let's have some fun, let's try to do this. Of course, he was making statements along the way while doing that, but I think he saw that early music as a kind of touchstone that you can always return to get a kind of jolt of energy.
As the 1950s drew to a close, many argued that rock and roll had become stale, but there were still artists making an impact. In particular, the singer Roy Orbison, whose brand of rock and roll tinged with melancholy would certainly have an effect on the then aspiring artist.
Roy Orbison kind of began as a quasi-country performer, but he really found his true identity at the beginning of the 60s, when he became the quintessential man in black with the dark glasses and more than a slight air of melancholia and despair.
It breaks your heart in two when she says to you, there's someone new.
His songs spoke of emotional desolation, Only the Lonely, It's Over. These are powerfully emotive songs, and he had the voice to match.
I mean, his voice had, the word that's almost always used is otherworldly. It really sounds like it's coming from another place. There's no sense in which Neil Young necessarily could sing was a singer on the level of Roy Orbison.
He said something once about this fucking opera singer with a backbeat, and I think he loved that sort of juxtaposition.
But even in his vocals, there is a similar sense of yearning, a sense of loss, and a sense also of finding an emotional place, an internal emotional place, and singing from that spot.
It's more than the sound even, it's a feel, a spirit. And they're very dramatic, those early Roy Orbison records, and I think he loved the drama of it.
There was always that air of dark mystery about Roy Orbison, the notion of hidden depths, that there was a deep and inexplicable sadness in Roy that nobody could quite articulate. And it's often said about Neil Young that, he had that same mystique about him, that there were dark areas in Neil's life. We always talk, when we even go right forward into the 70s, where, Neil Young seems to be also singing from a depth of despair at times.
There is a kind of place that Roy Orbison gets to that's sort of beyond whatever the song is. And I think Neil Young has that kind of aspiration in his music. I mean, it's not, there's the words and there's the music, but then there's also a place that he can take you to.
Only the lonely know the way I feel tonight. Only the lonely.
I think that you can see a considerable influence from those Roy Orbison records. When he gets into, with Buffalo Springfield and on his first solo album, some of these fairly sort of operatic, baroque, orchestrated type things, flying on the ground is wrong, and expecting to fly, and I think the almost operatic melodrama of some of those songs owes something to his early love of Roy Orbison.
You could argue, if you were being facetious, that Roy Orbison actually helped him without even knowing it at the beginning of his career. Possibly the first vocal performance by Young was in 1964 in his classroom, where he started growling "It's Over," which was an international hit for Roy Orbison, big #1 in the UK. And he was growling "It's Over" at the back of the classroom, and his teacher ordered him out and sent him to the principal. And the principal said, "I don't think you're interested in school. Maybe you should just pursue a career in music," which is the best career advice Neil Young probably ever got. Probably the only career advice he ever got, apart from his father. The Orbison link is there even in songs at times. The best one would be something like "Birds" on "After the Gold Rush." It's a very sad, lachrymose song, and it ends with the refrain, "It's over, it's over, it's over," which takes us right back to '64 in that classroom where he was singing that same ballad.
When you see me fly away without you, shadow on the things you know.
The rock and roll stars and singers of the 50s had brought music firmly to Neil Young's attention, and by the time he was 16, Young had settled in Winnipeg, Manitoba, a cold and bleak part of the nation, which unexpectedly offered up new influential avenues due to its thriving band scene and geographical position.
Winnipeg was a fairly isolated area because we're quite a ways from the East Coast, quite a ways from the West Coast, and so on. Of course, a lot of sports like hockey and things like that. And the band scene was quite active. Either people were playing in their garages or they were playing at canteens and churches and schools and things of that nature. So it was quite active.
In a place like Winnipeg, on the one hand, you're kind of isolated. It's not exactly a media center. On the other hand, musicians are passing through. There was an odd sense of kind of touring routes that would, bring, artists that you might not expect to be there would go there. Somebody like Neil Young could encounter them. He could hear these artists on the radio. So that idea that through the media and even physically that you could encounter these people, it was a much bigger deal.
We could pick up signals way down past the mid-states. And of course, most of them were music stations. So we sort of, as I remember, it seemed like when new music came out, there was a little lag before we got it. But because we could pick up these stations from farther away, you'd hear these new songs coming out.
Amongst that new music on the radio in the late 50s and early 60s was a surge of instrumental and surf rock, championed by several artists and bands such as The Ventures, The Tornadoes, Link Wray and Duane Eddy. The sound and style would have a profound effect on Neil Young and his eventual journey into the music world.